In 2008, a teenage boy chasing his dog into a South African cave fell through a crack in the floor and landed in a chamber filled with the bones of a human species no scientist had ever seen. A species that buried its dead 250,000 years before our own kind supposedly invented the idea. There are at least 9 more like them hiding in your family tree, and some of their DNA is still inside you right now. All right, let's go. Number 10. Homo luzonensis, the species that crossed an ocean it shouldn't have crossed. In April 2019, paleoanthropologist Armand Mijares of the University of the Philippines published a paper in Nature describing 13 bones and teeth recovered from Calao Cave in the limestone karst of northern Luzon. The fragments were small. Combined, they would barely fill a soup bowl. But the geology around them, and one specific bone in particular, forced a rewrite of a chapter that had stood for decades. The Philippines is an ecological problem. Even during the most extreme glacial maxima of the Pleistocene, when sea levels dropped 120 meters and exposed land bridges across most of Southeast Asia, the deep ocean trenches around Luzon never closed. The island has been a fortress for at least 2.5 million years. To get there, you have to cross water. Not a river, not a strait you can wade. Open ocean, kilometers of it, with strong currents pulling south toward Indonesia. The textbook position, until the early 2000s, was straightforward. Archaic hominids couldn't do that. Boat building, navigation, the abstract planning required to launch into invisible water, these were considered cognitive markers of Homo sapiens. Maybe late Neanderthals, nobody else. Then came the third metatarsal, the bone in the middle of the foot. The one from Calao Cave was strongly curved, in a way that hasn't been seen in any human foot for 2 million years. That curvature is associated with Australopithecus, the small-brained, partially tree-dwelling hominids that lived in Africa long before our genus appeared. It's a foot built for grip, not for long-distance walking. The bones dated to roughly 50,000 to 67,000 years ago. Sit with that for a moment. At the same time our direct ancestors were just beginning to push into Europe, a separate species, small, with feet that hadn't fully committed to the ground, was already on an island that nothing could walk to. How they got there is genuinely unresolved. The leading hypothesis is not that they built canoes. It's that ancestral populations may have been carried across on natural rafts of vegetation during typhoons, accidentally, in small founder groups over thousands of years. Tsunamis can move biological material across hundreds of kilometers. It only takes one successful crossing of a pregnant female to seed a new lineage. But even the accidental version is unsettling. It means the boundaries we drew. The idea that the ocean was a sealed door until Homo sapiens invented the key were wrong. The door was leaking the whole time. Small, archaic populations were spilling through it for hundreds of thousands of years. Most of them probably died. A few didn't. And the ones that didn't became something new in the dark of Calao Cave. We have 13 bones. That's the entire physical record of a species that crossed an ocean. Number 9. The Nesher Ramla people, who were sharing their technology with us. In June 2021, Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University published findings from a quarry south of Tel Aviv. Workers had cut through 8 meters of Pleistocene sediment to reach a buried sinkhole. Inside were fragments of a jaw, part of a skull, and something that mattered just as much. 6,000 stone tools, arranged in layers that told a story of habitation. The jaw had no chin. The skull was thick, primitive, more archaic than anything you'd expect from 130,000 years ago in the Levant. But the teeth were Neanderthal-like. The mosaic didn't fit any known category. The mainstream view, for most of the 20th century, placed Neanderthals firmly in Europe, a cold-adapted population that evolved in the glacial north and only later drifted south. Israel was supposed to be a corridor that Homo sapiens used to leave Africa, not a homeland for anyone else. The Nesher Ramla fossils suggest the Levant may have been something different, a basal population area, possibly part of the ancestral source for Neanderthals themselves, predating their full European form. Not all paleoanthropologists agree with that interpretation. Some argue these were simply a regional variant of an already known group. The debate is still active, but the tools are what stop the conversation. They were made using the Levallois technique. This is not stone bashing. Levallois requires you to look at a raw nodule of flint and visualize, before the first strike, a specific flake hidden inside it. You have to prepare the core through a sequence of preliminary blows so that the final target strike releases exactly the blade you imagined. It's a multi-step mental operation. It has to be taught, person to person, generation to generation. For decades, Levallois in the Levant was considered a signature of Homo sapiens, our cognitive fingerprint. The Nesher Ramla site shows the same technique, in the same place, at the same time, being used by people who weren't us. The implication is intimate. Technology this specific doesn't spread by accident. Someone watched, someone showed. Either we taught them, or they taught us, or both. And these were not abstract interactions. These were close encounters between two different kinds of human, sitting near the same fires, working the same stone, possibly trading knowledge in gestures and sounds that have left no record. The world of 130,000 years ago in what is now Israel was hotter than today, with seasonal rains feeding a network of springs and small lakes. The terrain around the Nesher Ramla site would have been semi-open woodland, with gazelle, aurochs, and ostriches drinking at the water's edge. The air would have carried the dry mineral smell of limestone dust and the sharp tang of flint being struck. You could have walked toward a fire in the evening and not known, until you got close, whether the people sitting at it were your kind or theirs. That is the part that's hard to absorb. Not the bones, the proximity. Number 8. Homo floresiensis, the species that broke the rule about brain size. In September 2003, an Australian-Indonesian team led by Mike Morwood was excavating Liang Bua, a vast limestone cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia. 6 meters down in volcanic sediment, they uncovered a nearly complete skeleton of an adult female. She had died at maybe 30 years old. She stood barely a meter tall. When the team submitted the find to Nature in 2004, the peer reviewers asked them to check it again. The numbers didn't make sense. Her brain volume was approximately 426 cubic centimeters, roughly the size of a grapefruit, smaller than the brain of a chimpanzee, smaller than the brain of Australopithecus, who lived 3 million years before her. Encephalization, the idea that human cognitive complexity scales with brain size, had been one of the load-bearing concepts of paleoanthropology for over a century. It made intuitive sense. Bigger brain, more capacity. Anything with a brain smaller than approximately 600 cubic centimeters was supposed to be cognitively limited to basic foraging. But the same sediment that held her skeleton also held thousands of stone tools, blades, points, scrapers. Charred animal bones from controlled fires, butchery marks on the remains of Stegodon, a dwarf elephant species native to Flores. There were also remains of giant marabou storks, birds nearly 2 meters tall, capable predators in their own right, and Komodo dragons larger than any alive today. A meter-tall hominid with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's was coordinating group hunts on dwarf elephants, controlling fire, and surviving alongside 2-meter storks and giant lizards. For nearly a decade, some researchers argued LB1 had to be a modern human with a pathology. Microcephaly, Laron syndrome, Cretinism. The argument wasn't really about the bone. It was about protecting the framework. If a 426 cubic centimeter brain could do this, then the framework was wrong. More individuals were eventually recovered. Different ages, different pathologies couldn't explain a whole population. The species was real. The current best explanation involves insular dwarfism, the well-documented evolutionary tendency for large mammals isolated on islands to shrink, sometimes dramatically, over tens of thousands of generations. The likely ancestor was Homo erectus, who reached Flores at least 700,000 years ago. The brain shrank along with the body, but cognition, somehow, did not shrink proportionally. The how of that is still genuinely open. One hypothesis: neural reorganization. Smaller neurons, denser packing, different wiring. Brains, it turns out, aren't measured in cubic centimeters the way engines are measured in liters. A motorcycle engine and a lawnmower engine can have the same displacement and do completely different things. The hobbits, as the press named them, survived in Liangbua until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly later. That overlaps almost exactly with the arrival of Homo sapiens in the region. We have never found out what happened next. Number 7. The Red Deer Cave People. A face from the wrong era in the wrong time. In 1989, miners in Maludong Cave in Yunnan, southwestern China, broke through a sealed chamber and recovered partial skeletons. The bones went into museum storage. They sat there for 23 years, partly because they were inconvenient. They didn't match anything the curators could confidently classify. In 2012, Darren Curnow of the University of New South Wales and Ji Shui-ping of the Yunnan Institute of Cultural Relics finally published a full analysis in PLOS 1. The skulls had no chin. The faces were short and flat, tucked under the brain case rather than projecting forward. Heavy brow ridges, thick cranial vaults, large molars. The kind of architecture that, in any other context, would suggest a hominid from 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. The bones dated to between 14,300 and 11,500 years ago. To translate that, when these people were lighting fires in Maludong Cave, the last ice age was ending. Climate was warming. Mammoths were going extinct in Siberia. In the Levant, the Natufians were starting to settle into permanent villages. Within 1,000 years of their final fires, humans would begin domesticating wheat. Within 3,000 years, the first temple complex at Göbekli Tepe would be carved into being. The agricultural revolution was about to start, and in a karst cave in southern China, a population of humans with archaic anatomy was still cooking giant extinct deer over an open fire. Now, the science is genuinely unsettled here. Some researchers argue the Red Deer Cave People are simply a regional variant of late Homo sapiens, modern humans whose anatomy retained or redeveloped some archaic features. Others argue they may represent a late surviving archaic lineage, possibly a hybrid population with deep ancestry. DNA recovery from the bones has been attempted, but the tropical preservation is poor, and definitive answers remain out of reach. What's not in question is the timing. Whatever they were here yesterday in geological terms. 11,000 years ago is closer to the smartphone than it is to the extinction of the dinosaurs by a factor of 6,000. There's something to sit with there. The world we think of as ours, the world after the last ice age, the human-dominated world, is younger than we admit. For most of human history, even after our species had spread to every continent, we were not alone. Other kinds of human were still alive, still hunting, still raising children in caves. The loneliness we feel as a species, the strange fact that there is no one else even remotely like us, is recent. It might be the youngest fact about us. The Red Deer Cave People, whatever they turn out to be, were among the last witnesses to a world where humanity meant more than one thing. Number 6. Homo longi, the skull from the well. The laborer who hid the Harbin skull never told anyone what he had done, except, at the very end, his family. When the cranium finally reached Changji at Hebei GEO University in 2018, it had been waiting in the dark for nearly 9 decades. The skull is enormous, larger than a modern human skull, with a brain capacity of approximately 1,420 cubic centimeters, within and slightly above the range of Homo sapiens. The face is something else entirely. Massive square eye sockets, brow ridges thicker than a finger, a wide, flat nasal opening, oversized teeth, no chin. But the cheekbones, oddly, are delicate, almost gracile. The combination doesn't match anything in the existing catalog. When Changji's team published in The Innovation in 2021, they proposed it as a new species, Homo longi, Dragon Man, after the Longjiang, Dragon River region where it was found. The phylogenetic analysis suggested longi might be more closely related to Homo sapiens than Neanderthals are. If that holds, and it's still being debated, it would mean the entire mainstream picture of who our closest relatives were has been wrong. For a century, Neanderthals occupied that position. Longi, or its lineage, might quietly take it. Subsequent work has gone further. In 2025, researchers analyzed paleoproteins, fossilized proteins, far more stable than DNA, from the Harbin skull and from a partial mandible recovered earlier from the Tibetan Plateau. The proteins matched Denisovan signatures. There is now a serious possibility that Homo longi, Dragon Man, is the Denisovan, that we have, for the first time, a face for the ghost. If that's correct, then everything in the next chapter has a body now. The world longi inhabited was brutal. Middle Pleistocene Manchuria, somewhere between 300,000 and 150,000 years ago, swung between glacial and interglacial periods. In the cold phases, winter temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius for weeks at a time. Rivers froze solid. The vegetation was mammoth steppe, grass and low scrub, with stands of cold-adapted trees in the river valleys. A brain that size requires roughly 20% of total daily calories just to maintain. To support it through a Harbin winter, longi had to be a high-efficiency apex hunter, killing large game consistently, processing fats and meat with control of fire, and probably organizing in small, coordinated groups. Imagine the breath in that air, the smell of wood smoke clinging to fur clothing, the sound of a frozen river cracking at night, sharp as a gunshot, while a small group huddled around coals in the lee of a rock outcrop. The dark would have lasted 16 hours, and inside that dark, brains as large as ours, but housed in faces we wouldn't recognize, were doing what brains do. Remembering, planning, telling stories we will never hear. The skull came back into the light in 2018. We are still learning what it has to tell us. Number 5. The Denisovans, the species we discovered by accident. In 2008, Russian archaeologists excavating a layer of Denisova cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia recovered a fragment of finger bone. It was about 7 millimeters long, smaller than a grain of rice. They thought it belonged to a Neanderthal child, or possibly an early modern human. They put it in a vial and shipped it to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, where Svante Pabo's team had been working on the chemistry of ancient DNA recovery. The cave is cold year-round. The DNA inside the bone was unusually well preserved. When the team sequenced the genome and compared it against the databases, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, neither matched. The bone belonged to a girl. She had lived around 50,000 years ago. She belonged to a species that had separated from the lineage leading to Neanderthals roughly 400,000 years ago. She had brown hair, brown eyes, brown skin. Beyond that, we had nothing. No skull, no jaw, no skeleton. The species was a complete unknown. This was the first time in the history of science that a new human species had been identified entirely from genetics. There was no body to point at. The species had no name yet, just an identifier, Denisova 3. What came next is the part that changes how you think about your own DNA. When researchers compared the Denisovan genome to modern human populations, the signal showed up immediately. Indigenous Australians, Papuans, and Melanesians carry roughly 3 to 5% Denisovan DNA. Trace amounts appear across mainland East Asia and even into the Americas. The implication was geographic. The Denisovans hadn't been a small population isolated in a Siberian cave. They had been continental, possibly spanning from Siberia to Southeast Asia, possibly crossing the same impossible water gaps that Homo luzonensis had crossed. Then came EPAS-1. In 2014, a team led by Rasmus Nielsen at UC Berkeley was studying why Tibetans can live at altitudes above 4,000 meters without their blood thickening into clots. The oxygen at that elevation is about 40% lower than at sea level. In a lowland human, the body responds by overproducing red blood cells until the blood becomes viscous and dangerous. Tibetans don't do this. Their version of the EPAS-1 gene regulates hemoglobin production differently. They breathe thinner air and stay alive. When Nielsen's team traced the origin of that specific gene variant, it didn't come from Homo sapiens. It was an exact match to the Denisovan genome. Somewhere, roughly 40,000 years ago, in a valley along the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, our ancestors met a Denisovan. They lived together long enough to produce children. Those children carried a gene that generations later allowed an entire civilization to settle the highest plateau on Earth. Every Tibetan monastery above 4,000 meters, every prayer flag, every chant echoing in those mountains, exists partly because of a brief encounter in the dark between two species tens of thousands of years ago. The Denisovan girl in the cave never knew. Neither did her descendants, but part of her is still climbing the Himalayas right now. The entirety of recovered Denisovan physical remains, a finger bone, 3 teeth, a jaw fragment, a few skull pieces, could fit inside a coffee mug. If Homo longi is the Denisovan, that mug just got a face. Number 4. Population Y, the ancestor who shouldn't be in the Amazon. In July 2015, Pontus Skoglund and David Reich, working out of Harvard Medical School, published a result in Nature that was, at first, treated as a contamination error. They had been running comparative genomic analyses on indigenous populations in the Americas. When they looked at the Surui and Caritiana, small, isolated tribes in the western Brazilian Amazon, they found a signal that should not have been there. A piece of their DNA matched, specifically and unambiguously, populations from Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. The standard model of how the Americas were populated had been the Beringian crossing, a single migration, roughly 15,000 to 25,000 years ago, of a Siberian-derived population across the land bridge into Alaska, then south through an ice-free corridor as the glaciers retreated. According to that picture, every indigenous person in the Americas descends from that founding wave. Anything else, especially anything implying ocean crossings, was treated as fringe. The Surui and Caritiana don't fit. The Australasian signal in their DNA is roughly 1 to 2%, small in absolute terms, but statistically unambiguous. It's not contamination. It's not noise. It appears in deep Amazonian populations that have had almost no contact with outsiders for centuries, and it does not appear at the same strength in indigenous groups further north. The signal is geographically concentrated. Something specific happened here. Skoglund and Reich called the ghost source population Population Y, from the Tupi word Ipicuera, ancestor. We have no bones for Population Y. No skull, no tool, no campfire that can be definitively tied to them. We know they existed only because their DNA is still inside people living in the rainforest today. They are a statistical inference made of blood. The mechanism by which their ancestry reached the Amazon is genuinely unsolved. The leading hypotheses are uncomfortable for different reasons. One possibility: a second, earlier coastal migration along the Pacific Rim, using boats to hop down the western edge of the Americas long before the Clovis-era inland route opened. Another, that the population that originally crossed Beringia was itself genetically structured, that within the founding group there were already people carrying deep Asian ancestry connected to the Australasian lineage, and that the signal got concentrated in certain South American populations by founder effects. A third, more radical hypothesis suggests direct trans-Pacific contact in deep prehistory, though most researchers consider this least likely given the distances involved. What's not in question is the fact of the signal. The Amazon basin during the deep past was not the closed-off jungle we imagine. Sea levels were lower, rivers ran different courses, coastlines that no longer exist offered routes that are now underwater. Whoever Population Y were, they walked or paddled or drifted across geography we cannot reconstruct, into a continent we thought we understood, and they left almost nothing of themselves behind, except the slow, patient writing of their genome into the people who came after. There is something humbling in that. The Surui and Karitiana are small communities, deep in a forest most outsiders will never see. They carry in their bodies the only remaining evidence that a forgotten chapter of human migration even happened. The bones of Population Y are gone. The river took them. The forest took them. But the code survived. You can't dig them up. You can only listen to what's still inside their descendants. Number 3. The West African Ghost, the ancestor with no fossil. In February 2020, Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman at UCLA published a paper in Science Advances that did something paleoanthropology had only done a handful of times before. It announced an entirely new archaic human species without producing a single bone. They had been running statistical analyses on the genomes of West African populations, the Yoruba of Nigeria, the Mende of Sierra Leone, and others. They were looking for stretches of DNA that didn't behave like Homo sapiens DNA. The mutation patterns were wrong. The structural signatures were wrong. The code was too old and too divergent to belong to anyone in the known human family. The data suggested that somewhere between 43,000 and 124,000 years ago, ancestral West African populations had interbred, repeatedly and on a large scale, with a deeply archaic human species that branched off from the line leading to us roughly 600,000 to 1 million years ago. The genetic contribution of this ghost species to modern West African genomes runs anywhere from 2 to as much as 19%, depending on the population and the method of analysis. For comparison, modern Europeans and Asians carry around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. The West African signal in some populations is an order of magnitude larger. That's not a brief encounter. That's a sustained biological merger, generations of contact. Communities that lived side by side, married each other, raised mixed children for thousands of years. And we have no idea what they looked like. The reason is climate. African paleoanthropology has always struggled with preservation. The acidic soils of the tropical and equatorial belt destroy bone rapidly. Heat, humidity, fungal activity, and burrowing insects dissolve organic material within centuries, not millennia. The cave-bearing limestone landscapes of Europe and southern Africa preserve fossils because the conditions are right. Most of West Africa does not. So we have for this species no skull, no jaw, no tooth, no identifying scrap. The entire physical record of an entire branch of humanity has been erased by mold and rain. What we have is the algorithmic shadow. Statistical software, looking at the DNA of living people, can see the outline of where this species used to be. The way astronomers infer black holes from the wobble of nearby stars. You can't see the object, you can see what it pulled on. The current best guess is that the West African ghost descended from an early offshoot of Homo erectus, or a closely related archaic species that stayed in Africa while other lineages migrated north into Eurasia. They evolved separately for hundreds of thousands of years. When anatomically modern humans expanded out of East Africa across the continent, they met this older population somewhere in the West African forest belt, and the boundary between species turned out to be permeable. The implication for the out-of-Africa model is significant. The traditional picture was of a single, relatively pure modern human population emerging from Africa and replacing archaic humans everywhere else. The reality is more tangled. Even inside Africa, modern humans were a mix. They were a braided river, picking up genetic material from older streams that joined and rejoined the main flow. The pure Homo sapiens that supposedly walked out of Africa was already a hybrid before they left. We are not the descendants of a single ancestral type. We are the descendants of a long, messy, continent-wide negotiation between multiple kinds of human. Most of those kinds left no bones, but they left themselves in us. If you have West African ancestry, somewhere between 2 and 19% of your genome may come from a species that science has never seen, will likely never see, and would not be able to name even if it walked into the room. Number 2. The Super-Archaic Lineage. A ghost inside a ghost. In February 2020, the same month as the West African paper, Alan Rogers and colleagues at the University of Utah published a study in Science Advances that pushed the same idea even further back in time. They had been running statistical models on the genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans, looking for evidence of older mixing events that might be hidden inside the data. The Denisovan genome held a signal that nobody had been able to explain. Roughly 1% of Denisovan DNA didn't fit. It was too divergent from human, Neanderthal, or any known archaic lineage. The mutations had been accumulating for too long. When Rogers' team ran the math, the answer came back. The source population had diverged from the human lineage approximately 2 million years ago. 2 million. That puts it close to the era of Homo erectus, the first hominid to leave Africa and spread across Eurasia. The standard model held that erectus either went extinct or evolved into descendants like Homo heidelbergensis, without leaving genetic traces in later humans. The data suggests otherwise. The data suggests that when the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans pushed into Eurasia roughly 700,000 years ago, they didn't find an empty continent. They found descendants of the earlier Homo erectus expansion, populations that had been evolving in isolation for over 1 million years, growing further from the rest of humanity in every generation. And the two groups interbred. This is what makes the result so strange. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred 50,000 years ago, the two lineages had been separated by roughly 600,000 years. That's already a long divergence, long enough that hybrid males appear to have had reduced fertility, based on the distribution of Neanderthal DNA across modern human chromosomes. There were biological costs to the encounter, even if it produced viable offspring. The Denisovan super-archaic mixing event involved two populations separated by 1.2 to 1.4 million years of independent evolution. That's twice the chasm. It is the deepest known interbreeding event between distinct human lineages anywhere in the fossil or genetic record. We do not have a name for the super-archaic population. We do not know where they lived, what they looked like, or how they died out. We know they existed only because a fragment of their DNA was passed forward, first into Denisovans, then, through Denisovans, into a small number of modern human populations in Asia and Oceania. They are a ghost inside a ghost. Their only echo is buried in the genome of another species that itself is known almost entirely from genetics. It's a strange recursion. Homo sapiens contains Denisovan DNA. Denisovan DNA contains super-archaic DNA. We are nested inside layers of ancestry that go back further than the fossil record has any way to track. Somewhere in the cells of someone living today, a Tibetan herder, a Papuan farmer, a Filipino schoolteacher, there is a piece of code that was last assembled in a body 2 million years ago, in a population that left no other trace of itself anywhere on Earth. The textbook image of human evolution is a tree. Clean branches, clear splits, a single trunk leading from past to present. The genetic data suggests something different, not a tree, a river system. Streams that split, rejoin, split again, carry water from sources upstream that no one can identify anymore. We are downstream of a watershed we cannot map, and every once in a while, when researchers look closely enough, they see another tributary that shouldn't be there. Number 1. Homo naledi, the species that broke the definition of humanity. In October 2013, 2 recreational cavers, Stephen Tucker and Rick Hunter, were exploring the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa's Cradle of Humankind, about 50 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg. They squeezed through a narrow chute, dropped into a chamber nobody had documented, and saw bones on the floor. They photographed what they found and brought the images to paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand. The expedition Berger organized to recover those bones became one of the most extraordinary archaeological operations of the century and one of the most contested. To reach the chamber where the bones lay, you have to navigate a labyrinth of pitch-black passages, climb a jagged rock formation called the Dragon's Back, and drop through a vertical fissure called the chute, a slot only 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point. Berger recruited a team of small-bodied female scientists who could physically fit through the gap. They became known as the underground astronauts. What they recovered from the Naledi chamber was a previously unknown species. Over 1,500 fossil specimens, representing at least 15 individuals, adults, juveniles, infants. The species was named Homo naledi. The anatomy was a paradox. The feet looked nearly modern, built for walking. The shoulders were primitive, configured for climbing. The hands had curved fingers good for hanging from branches, combined with thumbs precise enough for fine tool use. The body was small, about 1.45 meters tall, around 40 kilograms, and the brain was tiny, 450 to 600 cubic centimeters, roughly the size of an orange, about 1/3 the size of yours. Initially, naledi was assumed to be ancient. The anatomy looked archaic. The small brain looked archaic. The expected date was somewhere around 2 million years ago, consistent with early Homo. In 2017, when the dating finally came back, it was wrong by an order of magnitude. Homo naledi lived between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. That's not deep prehistory. That overlaps with the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Africa. A creature with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's was alive at the same time as the first modern humans, in the same part of the same continent. That alone would have been the story. But it isn't the story. The story is what they were doing in that cave. The Naledi chamber is 30 meters underground. To get into it, even with modern equipment and electric lights, requires technical caving skills. There is no natural light. There is no other entrance. Geological mapping has been thorough. The bodies didn't wash in. They weren't dropped through a sinkhole that later collapsed. The only way into that chamber was, and is, the same labyrinth the underground astronauts crawled through. And yet the chamber contains the remains of at least 15 individuals. Whole bodies, different ages. The placement is not random. In 2023, Berger's team published evidence that Homo naledi had been deliberately bringing their dead into that chamber. Some bodies appear to have been placed in shallow, oval pits dug into the cave floor. Soil micromorphology, the microscopic structure of the sediment around the bodies, is consistent with deliberate burial rather than natural deposition. The bones inside the pits show different decomposition patterns than the bones outside. They also found, on the walls of the passage leading toward the chamber, geometric carvings, cross-hatched lines, triangles, intersecting marks etched deep into the dolomite. The carvings have not been dated directly, but their stratigraphic position is consistent with the naledi occupation. If they were made by Homo naledi, they would be more than 100,000 years older than the earliest comparable symbolic markings made by Homo sapiens. And the soot. The team found extensive evidence of fire: charcoal, burned bone, smoke residue on the passage ceilings. Homo naledi was lighting fires inside the cave system, carrying torches through the labyrinth, burning fuel in chambers tens of meters underground. The implications, if all of this holds up under scrutiny, are difficult to absorb. A species with a brain a third the size of ours was making controlled fire, navigating a complex subterranean labyrinth in absolute darkness, carving symbols into rock, and disposing of their dead in what appears to be a ritualized way. These behaviors, mortuary practice, symbolic thought, fire control, were considered, until very recently, the exclusive cognitive signature of large-brained humans, of us and Neanderthals, and maybe Denisovans, not a creature smaller than a modern teenager with the cranial capacity of a gorilla. The backlash from parts of the academic community has been intense. Some researchers argue that the dating of the burials hasn't been done rigorously enough. Some argue that the carvings could be much younger, made by modern humans who entered the cave later. Some argue that fire could have entered the chamber through means other than deliberate torchcraft. The debate is not settled, and the standards of evidence for claims this big are, appropriately, very high. But the bones are there. The fires were lit by someone. The dead bodies got into that chamber somehow. And every conventional explanation, flooding, predator deposition, accidental falls, has been examined and found wanting. If Homo naledi really was burying its dead and carving symbols 300,000 years ago, then the connection between brain size and cognition that we built our entire model of human evolution on is broken. It would mean that the things we considered uniquely ours, the awareness of death, the impulse to mark, the capacity for ritual, appeared in lineages that diverged from us millions of years ago. It would mean that being human, in the cognitive sense, is older than the genus Homo, older than our species, older than any of us imagined. What stays with you about Rising Star is the image of it. A small creature, smaller than most adults, crawling through a 7-inch slot in the rock with the body of a dead child held against its chest. Stopping in the dark to light a torch. Continuing through passages no human eye has seen for 250,000 years. Reaching a chamber and laying the body down in a shallow grave. Scratching a mark on the wall. Climbing back out. We don't know what they were thinking. We don't even know if thinking, as we understand it, is the right word for what they were doing. But they were doing something. And whatever it was, it required them to want to do it. Deep in the dark, alone, with no audience. That's the part that doesn't go away. 10 ghosts. Some of them have bones. Some of them have only DNA. Some are pieces of skull found in a Chinese well after 85 years of hiding. Some are statistical anomalies in the blood of people who have no idea they're carrying them. Some are footprints, tools, fires, marks scratched into walls in caves no one will ever fully explore. What links them is not size, not skull shape, not where they lived or how long ago. What links them is that each of them complicates the story we told ourselves about who we are. The textbook version of human evolution, the version most of us grew up with, was clean. A single line, a handful of branches. Australopithecus, then Homo erectus, then Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, with us standing alone at the end of the road. Triumphant, inevitable, unique. The version that's emerging now is different. It's less a line and more a fog. There are species in it we have not named yet. There are populations we can detect only as patterns in the genome of their descendants. There are encounters between groups of humans separated by 1 million years of evolution. Encounters we have no way of imagining because they happened in a world where being human meant more than one thing. The planet was once crowded. The corridors of Eurasia were full. The forests of Africa held lineages we will never see directly. Boats, or driftwood, or accident, carried small populations across oceans we thought were impassable. Cognition appeared in skulls we thought were too small to hold it. The dead were buried in caves whose only entrance was a 7-inch crack in the rock. Every one of them is gone. Most of them died out before we did, and we never met them. Some we did meet. Some we interbred with. Some we may have outlived only by accident. What stays of them, mostly, is fragments. A pinky bone in Siberia. A foot bone in the Philippines. A skull hidden in a war. A signal in the DNA of a tribe in the Amazon. A trail of footprints. A grave at the bottom of a cave. And inside us, more than we knew, lives the inheritance of those encounters. Tibetans climb the Himalayas on Denisovan lungs. Europeans carry Neanderthal sleep patterns and immune responses. Papuans hold a piece of a super-archaic ancestor that vanished before our species had a name. West Africans contain whole lineages that left no other record. Our genome is not a single text, it is an archive, a layered, half-erased, much-edited record of every cousin we ever absorbed. When we look in the mirror, we see one face. The genetics suggest something stranger. We are the survivors of a long, mostly invisible series of negotiations between species that were not quite us, who lived alongside us, who taught us things, who gave us fragments of themselves and then disappeared. We are not alone because we are special. We are alone because everyone else is gone. And what's still out there? In the limestone caves of Indonesia, in the river sediments of China, in the unread genomes of small communities in the Amazon and the Sahel and the Pacific. What's still out there is more of the same. More ghosts, more cousins, more ways of being human that we will recover, one fragment at a time, for as long as the work continues. If this video stayed with you, subscribe. There is much more to come. The megafauna our ancestors hunted to extinction, the climate shifts that ended entire branches of humanity, the prehistoric mysteries still locked in ice and stone. And in the comments, which of these ghosts surprised you the most? Which one feels closest to you? Which one, if you could meet, would you want to sit across from in the dark for an hour and try to understand? The answers, like the ghosts themselves, say more about us than we usually admit. Until next time.